Hi, and welcome to A Different Atheist Reads, A History of God by Karen Armstrong. I'm Kristi, and in today's lecture, I want to get over the second part of what I set up last time, so we're going to finish that up. And then in the next video, we're finally going to get to what Karen has to say. So we're going to start this week by looking at two priestly writers, and then we're going to compare the worldviews of Proverbs and Job, and then we're going to get on to Karen's book in the next video. You guys ready? Okay, let's go. First, a shout out to Michael Summers, who sent me a comment actually today, in the last few hours before I recorded this video, to notify me that there is a book based on the Christine Hayes course that I've been using. And so what I will do is I will add that link into the D box below. So thank you so much for that recommendation. And now that we have that extra information, we can get going. In the last video, I mentioned the idea that purity can be both moral and ritual, that it has a lot of different dimensions. It's geographical. It is material in that objects can be made to be used by God. And also time can be sacred. So the idea of there being a holy day and a holiest of days. And this has a real three-dimensional sort of feel to it. That's again, the older tradition, the priestly tradition that Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah in some ways will be reacting against. So in terms of Ezekiel and his writings, this is definitely within the P school, the priestly influence. He has two basic messages, one blaming the people for failing to live up to their responsibilities, and that is why God is punishing them with exile, and then also the idea of a new temple. He is similar to the priestly writings and the holiness texts, those are P and H in terms of his language. Before the fall, the pre-fall prophecies had to do with the visions and oracles that condemned the people, that the individual is personally responsible for their sin, and has a view of, it's a sort of a xenophobic view of those who are uncircumcised. Again, this is men talking to other men, so women don't really rate in this discussion. After the fall, then what you see are oracles of promise and hopes for the future, and also of a temple rebuilt. So that's the basic narrative arc. Ezekiel is the first prophet to be called outside of the geography of Israel. And this is quite important when you think about the geographical ties that the priestly school or the rituals had in terms of keeping God near his people. When Ezekiel describes his vision of Yahweh, Christine Hayes points out that it is not that dissimilar to the descriptions of Baal. So we still have a lot of pagan references and similarities that are happening in the region. The cloud that hides the presence of God is similar to the description of Exodus. In Exodus, this cloud that has the presence of God settles on Sinai, and in the language of the text, when God comes into the tabernacle, he fills the tabernacle, and is God's appearance, the presence or the appearance of the presence of the semblance of God is in that place. So in his language, and I'll get it right this time, Ezekiel refers to experiencing the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. And so this is a moving away from the very sort of nearness, making God increasingly transcendent. So he saw the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord, pushing it farther and farther away. He also uses the phrase Son of Man, and according to Hayes, this is done to contrast it with the notion of divinity. So Ezekiel is a son of man, whereas Yahweh is separate. Remember that priestly notion of God being completely other and separate. In Ezekiel's vision, he sees God moving from the temple in Jerusalem to the east. So again, this represents that notion that God has a geography and is physical and spatial and can actually get up and move. And here, it calls back to the pagan idea of gods leaving their cities in anger or when they have been defeated by another god. But in this case, the narrative is slightly transformed to say not that God is leaving in anger or that he is being defeated, but rather God moves into exiles with the righteous who kept his laws, or the righteous exiles. And so this is an explanation, a salvaging of the religious faith from the Yahwehist side, that their God actually transcends geography and is connected to their people. After the fall, then the message changes, and there is a vision where he sees the presence of God returning. And this again is not necessarily linked, the return of the exiles and the return of the temple is linked to the people, not to the geography. I think in her discussion, Christine Hayes mentions that this is where you get away from the exiles, where you end the state of Israel and you start the religion of Judaism. So those first seeds of God's movement and connection to the people beyond geography are found here. Ezekiel was quite attention-seeking. He did a lot of things in a performance sort of way to demonstrate to shock people. For instance, he cooked his food over human excrement. He also apparently did not mourn his wife in order to represent the way that Yahweh would not mourn the loss of his temple. But his real messages were about idolatry and moral purity. Those who heeded the warnings of Yahweh and faithfully executed his laws would be spared, and it would be the individual's responsibility, not a collective responsibility that was happening to the people. Ezekiel's emphasis is on the dangers of idolatry and also of moral impurity. He has a worldview of personal responsibility, individual responsibility. So rejecting this notion from earlier in the Bible that children will bear the sins of their parents, and this is now rejected. We see that even Chronicles rewrites Kings, which is an earlier book, to eliminate the Deuteronomic view of delayed punishment. So we see these revisions happening as the Bible progresses. Now, Ezekiel and his followers rejected intergenerational punishment, and that they said that God does not work that way anymore. So again, quite a fluid theological interpretation. Ezekiel presents basically a religious utopia. He presents a vision of a place where God's laws are followed and observed, and the people are dwelling in perfect, sort of unity with God and God with his people. In this vision, God would restore a purified Israel to its land with a Davidic prince. Because they were in exile, they couldn't do their normal sacrifices. This became replaced with other rituals that filled the gap. For instance, praying in the direction of Jerusalem. The importance of the Sabbath increased. The idea of confession and atonement rather than ritual to make things right. And with this change, with these alterations and new practices coming in to replace the ones that happened before the exile, Judaism actually started to attract God-fearers or followers. And a God-fearer, for those of you who don't know this term, it's basically, again, a men, because it's about men. I'm sure there were women God-fearers, but the main difference between a person who was sort of a real Jewish convert and a God-fearer was circumcision. So if you were a guy and you were interested in following Yahweh, but you didn't want to get cut, you couldn't actually be a full member of the community, but you could be like an associate. So it was better than being on the outside. You'd still get all the kind of perks. You just wouldn't get the best seats. So this is basically what a God-fearer is. And we see this in the New Testament. The Roman centurion is implied to be a God-fearer, but not a convert. He's not actually Jewish. He seems to be more of a person who is sympathetic to Yahweh and might follows Yahweh without actually converting fully to Judaism. It might just be worth pointing out here that the Bible is not a unified text. It's not a book, it's a library. It's a collection of writings from different historical periods in different situations with a range of perceptions about God. It does not speak with a single voice on matters of theology, and its aim is to try to create a narrative that makes sense of the events of what happened to the people of Israel in light of their monotheism. It's not theology, it's interpretation. An example of how the book is not merely a single theological perspective is if you ask, are humans free moral agents? And you go to the Bible, you get both answers. There's a dialectic going on between views over time, and people are changing what God thinks is appropriate or how God behaves and acts in order to have it reflect their situations, their understandings of the world. We tend to come to the Bible with Hellenistic ideas that if something is true, then it can't have any contradictions in it, that there's a sort of singularity and simplicity is more aesthetically attractive than complexity in different parts. But that's not how these writers are thinking about it. And that's why I do think it's important to have a decent explanation of the worldview when you approach the text. And that's why I'm doing this section, because I don't think Karen does a very good job of that. So let's move on to 2nd Isaiah. Now this book was not written by Isaiah, it comes much later, and it contains consolation to the exiles. It tells them that God will lead the people back from exile like a shepherd during a new exodus. God is a God who always fulfills his promise, and this is the hope that is given to the people in exile. There is more explicit monotheism in this text, much more than in 1st Isaiah. You see that God is controlling all of the nations, and this includes using other nations to punish Israel. This author satirizes idols, and through it has God challenging the idols to answer for themselves, as if, God would put up a piece of wood and go, okay, have a conversation with me. Yeah, that's kind of how it's presented in order to satirize their impotence against God's power. And the idea here is, again, that the only real God is the God of Israel. So that's the kind of a push that comes out of 2nd Isaiah. So having looked at the priestly tradition and Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about the wisdom literature. First, I want to set up the context of the wisdom literature in the areas generally, and then look at Proverbs and compare it with Job. Israelite wisdom literature actually is embedded within a culture of Near Eastern wisdom traditions. So you have the Egyptian tradition, you have the Babylonian tradition, and those feed into and are drawn upon in what we find in the Bible in terms of its wisdom literature. Many of the Proverbs deal with family or clan issues and are addressed to younger men. There are no proverbs that are designated that you can find that would be relevant to a daughter. So this is very much men writing for other men. In Proverbs, the first piece of advice is to warn against the seductions of foreign women, right? Foreign women who will take their sons away from their practices and their cultures and traditions, and instead the author sort of advises young men to pursue wisdom. And in this pursuit of wisdom, wisdom is made out to be a woman, right? So that you're pursuing her as a love, as a romantic partner, as a passion. What I want to point out about Proverbs in this lecture, and use it to kind of link this theme back through the last two videos, is the notion of, from Proverbs, it seems almost a glib certainty that the righteous will prosper and the wicked will receive their punishments. There's a complacency here, or an assumption, an optimism that God's providence is in the world, that there is a moral order, and that things happen for a reason. So if you are good, you will get good things. And if you're a bad person, then bad things will happen to you. And this isn't questioned at all. It doesn't really engage in any kind of critique with this. The worldview, according to Proverbs, is that everything is ordered according to God's moral justice. Good people are rewarded, bad people are punished, and it's really as simple as that. If you receive good things, it means you're a good person. If you receive suffering, it means you must be doing things that are sinful. And that's the outlook of Proverbs. It just trusts completely in God as the moral organizer of the universe. That there is an order, God is behind it, and you can trust in God. According to Hayes, this insistence on the basic justice of the world and the power of wisdom or fear of the Lord to guarantee success and security was one strand among many of ancient Israelite thought, but it reaches its crystallization in the book of Proverbs. This harkens back to the Deuteronomistic school, that is unwilling to give up the idea of a moral God that is in control of history. And also from then you can infer that if the nation is suffering, it is also sinful. So it's better to blame Israel and keep God and divine retribution intact than to question it. But it's precisely this kind of worldview that is challenged by Job, and that is the book we're going to turn to now. Job is not an Israelite, and the story does not take place in Israel. In fact, scholars now think that Job is a much earlier work. It was a traditional work, and that it was brought into the story because it has two very distinctive parts. There's a prose part that sets up the story and closes the story, and then starting, I think it was around chapter 3, there's a poetic section that takes up most of the book of Job. If you were to take out the prose section, that would be the story arc of there's this cool guy named Job, and he was really righteous, and then there was the Satan, the accuser, who made a bet with God, and the Satan went and messed with Job for a bit, but Job was just steadfast in his belief in God. And then if you jump to the end, it looks like God, you could just eliminate the middle bit, and then it would look like Job was rewarded for his patience and his perseverance. But a later author came along and inserted this sort of rant. Christine Hayes can do a much better job on Job than I can, but there are a few points that I do want to mention. The basic premise of Job's interlocutors in the poetic part is that justice must be divine, and therefore there can be no undeserved suffering. And Job is the person who is saying, I didn't do anything wrong, I don't deserve such treatment. So he is the counter voice to that world that, well, if something bad happened to you, you must have deserved it, which I think we can still recognize very much in our societies today. Job is a really complicated book, and Christine Hayes does a very good job of this, and this video is getting long, so let's wrap it up. The thing that I want to point out about Job is that it takes on the glib certainty of Proverbs and starts to smash it all to pieces. It takes that earlier naivete and starts to bring some realism to it, and it does that through the person of Job, a person who is innocent and yet suffers, and how can that happen if God is good? And that's the basic, nub of Job, and it's why it's an evolution, why it's a step forward in terms of the theological development. Hayes summarizes Job by saying that God is no longer seen as a moral accountant, that events that happen in the world that are attributed as part of divine justice are wrong because they either are used to attribute sin to people or to perceive that they are being unjustly punished by God. So the error of Job's friends was that they assumed because Job was suffering, he had done something wrong. And Job's error was that to assume bad things are going to happen because God does them or doesn't do them to you is you're assuming a kind of injustice, as if the world should be morally accountable. So it's not a satisfying answer, but I think it's a more realistic one. And I can see why Job is one of people's favorite books of the Bible. And again, just to reiterate, Job is liberated from what he would now see as a false expectation raised by the Deuteronomistic notion of a covenantal relationship between God and humanity, and that this covenantal relationship was being enforced by a system of divine justice. And that's pretty much it. You think about it, I want to say that one more time because it's actually, I think, well said and cogent. Job is liberated from what he would now see as a false expectation raised by the Deuteronomistic notion of a covenant relationship between God and humanity, enforced by a system of divine justice. And that is, I think, the real transition. We've lost our concepts list because we had to go off the book, but I'll get back to it. I'll get back to it probably after the next video. But this is definitely a transition and an evolution in the theology. Right. So now we've done enough background training and information gathering to make sense, or at least correct the errors that I found in Karen Armstrong's book and on this topic. So this is going to be the end of this video. I'm not done yet. I'm going to just continue and start making the next video, but you guys are done. So I will see you back here tomorrow because I'll put up the video right away and get that double episode that I promised you. And we will then be all caught up ready for the rest of 2015. So as always, I've been Kristi. As always, you've been awesome. And I'll see you tomorrow on A Different Atheist Reads. Bye.